Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, good evening, depending upon where you are today. So today we are going to be primarily focusing on how to write good user stories. Again, for those of you that know me already, my name is Sriram Rajagopalan. I am working as an enterprise Agile evangelist with Inflectra Corporation currently. I have my doctoral degree in organizational leadership and management, business management degree, a Master of Science in Computer Engineering, and a bachelorate in Electronics and Communication Engineering. For the work experience, I have worked as a software engineer and moved along, serving in a number of roles: team leader, business analyst, project manager, scrum master, and an agile coach. And I have served in the capacities of a director and vice president as well. A number of different certifications to my credential, which include portfolio management, program management, project management, schedule, risk management, agile, scrum master, scrum developer, scrum product owner, Sarbanes-Oxley certification, Six Sigma black belt, and I'm also an instructional designer, speaker, writer, and author. I have teaching and training experience in a number of different organizations within United States, India, Vietnam, and a number of other organizations virtually. So today's webinar is going to be part of the 4-part series. On the third webinar series that we have, this is the Journey into Agile with Inflectra. Each webinar is targeted to be approximately 1 hour long, and we will reserve time at the end for questions. The webinars may introduce the concept using a tool, but the focus is not necessarily on any particular tool at this point. So the 4 seminars are supposed to be Agile engineering practices for software product development, which we concluded, and we are focusing on writing good user stories now. And then we will be focusing on patterns to avoid in Agile ceremonies and incorporating Lean and Kanban in product lifecycle management. So some of my experience is what I am using to actually write this particular best practices in writing good user stories. And one of the things that I have found out is, regardless of the type of project delivery mechanism, that is whether you are using Project Management Institute, PMBOK approaches, or Agile framework, Scrum, Prince2, regardless of what that framework is, internal and external stakeholders look at a few important things, and those are increasing value to the customer, increasing quality to the product that you are working on, reducing time to market, and reducing cost to operations. Now, if the user stories that you write do not target these 4 elements, then we are not maximizing the benefits, and ultimately benefits translate into values, and value maximization is the focus of Agile as well as any project delivery mechanism. Right? So what's the role of user stories over here? Now, if you look at the state of Agile, the one that is published in 2019, the 13th state of Agile by version 1, there are 4 important things that people say that are really required in terms of Agile. Let's take a look at them. Daily stand-up has 86%, the sprint iteration planning 80%, sprint iteration review 80%, and retrospective 80%, short iterations 67%. And in fact, the 4 different ceremonies are listed right here. And when you look at these 4 important ceremonies, every one of them focus on user stories. During the daily stand-up, you are having dialogue around the user stories. When you are doing iteration or sprint planning, you are talking about what user stories have to be actually implemented. During the review, you are actually demonstrating the completion criteria of your user stories to make sure that they can be accepted by the product owner. And later during the retrospective, you are reflecting on the work that you are doing. It may or may not involve the user stories, and the short iterations definitely work on user stories as well in terms of what you can actually get done. So when you look at these things, the user stories are the bread and butter of any Agile specific development at this point, right? So based upon my experience, I have come down with 4 important practices, which is what I'm going to expand. So the first practice is more about understanding the persona first. We talk about user stories, but we need to understand the persona. The next one is going to be focusing more on the big picture while following the company policies. The next one is going to be iterating towards getting to ready and then getting to done. So we'll talk about those two things. And then finally, promoting more and more about team collaboration, because all these things are critical, important, pivotal pillars for writing good user stories. So let's take the first one. Within the first one, I'm going to come up with a couple of ideas over here. Now, number one is going to be, we talk about users, but we need to actually personify the users and think holistically about the system meaning the actual platform or the product that you are actually delivering. Right. So when you take a look at these particular thing, user story is all about the relationship. It's not just going and saying like, as somebody, I want to do this so that I can do this. Yes, that's the framework, that's the template, but user story is all about the relationship. Now, what do we talk about relationship over here? Normally, we basically start looking at the user needs a particular product functionality, right? We basically say, as a user, I want this so that I can do this. That's pretty much the template that we govern by. But that's at a very high level. That's not necessarily going into the details when you are looking at a holistic system, because when you're looking at one particular thing, you're looking only at that particular aspect and you are not looking at how this one plays in the context of the big picture, right? So you have to start thinking in terms of personifying the user. As soon as you start thinking in terms of different types of users, you are creating persona. And from that persona, you have to do this needs assessment. And a number of different Agile books talk about persona in a different way, also like a user proxy and all those things. But at the end of the day, you are creating some kind of a classification of the different types of users and then assess the needs assessment. So it's not just one individual user, but it's going to be one category of users. And from that particular needs assessment, you are writing the user stories. Now, that's not completely full story too. You also have to start looking at the actual system that delivers the ecosystem within which all these persona work. And so all the different platforms that has to be taken into consideration, from a reliability, from a stability, from a security, from a performance, and all those things have to be factored in, and multiple other internal stakeholders come in and weigh on these particular things. And as a result of that, you develop additional, technical process value add user stories. So you need to actually start developing not only just the customer value add stories, but you should also start looking at the business value add stories, the technical value add stories, and the process value add stories. And we have alluded to that in other seminars as well. Right now, from there, you have to start taking a look at use cases and user stories. And there is a feeling right now that a number of people say use cases are for traditional linear waterfall approaches. They do not belong in the user stories or agile development methodology and things like that. I have different viewpoints on that, but my own thought process is, when you take a look at the needs may come from different types of persona. It could be from multiple users that are interfacing with the system. It could be the actual system itself that is interfacing, the different mechanism by which people are interfacing, and there are also other things like automated engines that are interfacing with the system. So there are a number of different ways you can actually start looking at them. And as you are trying to look at those high-level functionality, you are looking at the use cases. So oftentimes when somebody is coming and saying like, we need this, how many people are asking for this? Why do we need this? What's the business need for this? What's the impact? What should we have done already before we move forward? What are some of the exception flows that we have to consider? All those things are, use cases. So you basically start looking at some of the use cases to figure out like, okay, how do we move forward? And once you have some needs assessment completely done, you start then taking a look at some of the big level features that you have to develop as part of your delivery. And from that, you are developing the roadmap, the product roadmap. Sometimes it could be the program roadmap as well. From there, you are beginning to fill the product backlog, and the product backlog could be just the customer value add stories, as well as some of the design, architecture, quality related stories that needs to be factored in, as I just mentioned. And then the iteration starts at this point. The cycle starts as you are looking at the user stories and filling the backlog, and you are trying to do the review and all those things. So each and every one of those things keeps adding more and more to the product backlog, because you are by definition extending the system. right, and the functionality. And as a result of these things, you will end up with additional big level items that you have to start doing some market research, and that market research may actually go into additional use cases as well. So this is the cycle that repeats. So you don't directly start writing user stories without understanding the big picture, because if you don't understand the big picture of the business need and the business impact of delivery or non-delivery, your Agile is not necessarily going to quickly deliver the value as expected. So what are some of the good stories in this particular context from based upon my recommendation or practice? The first thing is stories should be identifying some specific goals to interact with the product. Without a specific goal, you are really not necessarily coming down with a proper value stream mapping. You're just doing something in the name of Agile and not necessarily actually trying to solve a business problem. Okay. The second thing is the story should be a collection that represent the whole. So each and every individual user stories may not necessarily be the representation of the entire system, but if you actually group them and categorize them, they should talk about the characteristics of the system. So we have to start thinking in terms of some of those aspects like security, performance, those things that I talked about as well. And then the story should be written in such a way that in the future, not too far future, in the immediate future, it reduces the technical architecture issues. Like, if only I had this database built, if only I had this index already available, if that port is open already, or if this functionality exists, I will be able to do this. Those are, blocking the implementation. So some level of forethought has to exist. And that's not immediately, a big upfront planning. It's just, a little bit of a forecasting into the future. And those are part of some aspects of your release planning as well. And finally, the story should be written in such a way that you are able to release some partial functionality. Because if you're not able to release some partial functionality and everything has to be, one big, final release, then you are losing the ultimate value of Agile in the first place to begin with. You need to be able to reduce to release functionality so that you are able to actually get the feedback from the customer and continuously improve. So these are some elements of good user stories from practice one, right? But in addition, I also say like abuser persona. Several years back, I was attending an Agile conference where I basically heard about this Agile abuser persona, and I wrote about this, further. So one of the things is, you are always looking for happy path scenarios, but don't look for happy path scenarios alone. Look for some of those unhappy, paths. If things don't work out, what will happen? So maybe a user that is frustrated and not able to find out certain things on the website or the mobile app or whatever the product may be. Or somebody is a non-technical user. So the expectation is, you make it very clear for that person to interface with your technical product. Somebody have a mal intent, they are the hacker and they're trying to actually, break the system. And sometimes there may be users with some disabilities that are trying to interface with the system. So think about this extended persona who could actually be abusing the system or who could be actually benefiting from the system in a different way. So think about those things and diversify the user persona to alternate ways of interactions. Right. So if you are having a two-factor authentication, if the phone is not available, you are trying to make sure if the texting functionality is not available, you are looking for an email functionality, things of that nature. And then expand user persona for experience not intended. What that particular user can use this product differently than original intent was. If that is something that you have understood, then try to block that functionality from being made available. Right. For instance, avoid failure from working as design mantra. People are constantly saying this is working as design. Well, if it is being exposed, then, maybe people are trying to interface with the system in a different way and try to understand that and see if you can bulletproof or, make it a little bit more robust. Close any security loopholes like a backdoor policy that is being not addressed properly. So try to make sure that you are closing the gaps over there. And finally, don't fall for what many people call us Yagni. This is you ain't gonna need it. Like, if everything is looking fine, you're not going to need it, so we don't need this. These are the features that people are probably trying to say, and you have to put them in the backlog and evaluate whether there is a proper need for it, and then appropriately prioritize based upon the Moscow approaches, like the must, should, could, and won't, and all those things. But at least gather the information more and more so that you are able to flesh out the requirements much in the future as part of your grooming. That's the first step, practice. Now, the second practice that I'm going to look at is, think again from a very big picture. So continuously iterate through the features and follow some of the company policies. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look at this. So some of the prerequisites for backlog is called a deep property. And this is one of the agile approaches that basically say, a backlog should have this kind of a property. And deep stands for detailed appropriately. The D stands for. So it means you are trying to put some thoughts over here, ideas, some feedback that people are gathering, all those things you are putting. But the expectation is that somebody else will do the follow-up, evaluate it, and all those things. So neither too much, not too little information. So don't discard any idea because that's not required and things like that. Somebody has to go through this quickly and evaluate whether there is a business need for it. Maybe not now, but maybe in the future that may be required. The next one is going to be estimable. At some point, the user story has to be estimable, but at this point, it's a backlog. Just an idea in the backlog. It's not completely fleshed out, so it needs to go through a few iterations before it becomes, unambiguous for somebody to actually start the estimation process as part of the iteration planning. But the more information, the better at this point. The next one is going to be emergent. I already mentioned this. You are trying to constantly revisit this to see how it can be split up or how it can be broken down into multiple functionality and things like that. So it's not a static representation. It's going to be constantly evolving through multiple iterations, right? And then prioritize. Again, as part of all these things, you try to go through and find out which is the most important things that are really required for the customer value add, business value add, and all those things, and then try to prioritize accordingly. Now, that's the prerequisite for a backlog, right? That means you are putting all the stories as much as you want, but letting as a team to refine them as time permits. The user story, in my humble opinion, is more like a contract. So whenever it is committed, somebody is actually working on this. So the three important C's of user story is this, the card, conversation, and confirmation, right? So when you look at this, the card is basically telling how small the story is going to be, so that it is something that is very small and estimable, and we are able to accomplish that. That's the fundamental behind small real estate area of a card. The next one is going to be the conversation. The conversation is the dialogue. The product owner, the team members, the Scrum Master, and other stakeholders are required, or engaging in a conversation to make sure that the story is something that can be done and it's ready for the next stage. The next one is going to be the confirmation. The confirmation is primarily focusing on what are some of the criteria by which the story will be evaluated, so that it's considered like quote complete or done, right? When you look at this is an agreement between customer and the team. So when this is agreed upon and finalized and all those things, it is nothing more than an agreement between a customer and the team, and so I use the term contract. It captures the high-level requirement. Although it is called high-level, it is supposed to be at a granular level that somebody can actually do this. It's not like a huge one. It's supposed to be something that can be done within that iteration that you have agreed upon. And it describes enough details for planning estimates. In other words, it's not having too much documentation and all those things, but at the end of the day, it's going to give you, what do I have to do to get this completed? And finally, the acceptance criteria for testing. So that testing meaning whether it is going to be an automated test, or whether it is going to be a manual test, or if it's going to be some user acceptance testing done by additional members. So whatever all those things are, what is considered to be success criteria for testing. So all these things needs to be there. While I'm saying this, there are going to be some regulatory legal compliance nature of the businesses that may actually require some documentations to be managed. Now, if that's truly the case, the user story itself is not going to be a documentation enough. Because different audit considerations may require different kind of documentations to be developed, and so you cannot consider that the user story is similar to code, like it's self-documenting and things like that. So you really have to come up with some additional stories that basically meet the documentation needs. Either you are setting aside some time for actually developing the documentation, or you are investing in some kind of a tool that basically creates the appropriate documentations from different artifacts that you have in the system, right? So what are some of the good user stories from that particular aspect? Now, a lot of times there has to be some kind of a low fidelity model that the product owner develops for the particular project or the product. And that should provide some representation of the user interface as well as the user journey. That cannot be something that you can completely ignore to the end and expect this to automatically evolve, right? And so you have to understand from that. So let me explain that with an example over here. So let's say I'm trying to build a training class website. Okay, this is the home page, and the home page has a few functionalities. So this is how I'm developing the mind map. So I have people that can come and search for classes, and then they can browse other resources like podcast or some interactions that I have built, or some articles or blog articles, and all those things. All those things are there. They can even preview a module before they want to enroll in the class or whatever it is. And when you look at the search classes, they can filter by a specific criteria, by location, by cost, by certification, or whatever it is. You are adding that information. And based upon that, there's going to be two things. The person enrolls in the class, or the person looks up and does nothing. On the other hand, people are browsing constantly a few types of resources, and now you want to make sure that you are monitoring that engagement, how often they are coming, where are they watching, and what kind of process they are watching. And based upon that, you want to recommend a close or monitor their enrollment, right? And if they are responding to those events, you may want to come up with some promotions and all those things, discounts and all those things, and then basically get them to enroll for classes. This is an approach that I'm having right now. So at every one of those things, I have to build this model, low fidelity model, in my mind, so that I'm able to come back and say, this is the functionality. So they should be able to look for filtering very easily. They should have a few things about resources. So I'm building this thing, and this helps me develop and flush out new types of user stories that I basically should have. Otherwise, I'm just letting everything evolve without necessarily having a strategy around it. There is in the strategy world, people call it serendipity, like it just evolves accidentally and not necessarily by by a conscious strategical choice. The next one is going to be build constraints. So sometimes, as you are building this low fidelity model, you may be thinking like, oh, enroll for classes. Am I allowing somebody to actually pay online? So that means I have to build an online cart or something. So before that functionality is there, I should actually have this functionality developed. So I'm building some constraints into this. And as a result, I'm basically saying, okay, putting a note and say, this is a good idea, but in order for me to move forward, I should have another story flushed out. It's just a placeholder for me. I can go and look at how the shopping cart should be implemented at a separate point and start iteratively evolving it. But at least it gives me how I want to look at this and how my product roadmap is evolving. And it gives the senior management confidence in terms of how the stories are actually developing towards the end goal that they are looking for, ultimately the value and benefits. Right? Sometimes the documentation needs come up, as I mentioned before. And so when you're looking at this, look at this from a requirements. So most often the audit considerations will be focusing only on these things, like, how are you doing the requirements management and what kind of testing process exists in terms of mapping the requirements to the test cases. How did you go about the defect triaging process and figure that out, and then what was your management controls that you had? So depending upon that, you may want to have different things. So preferably, a tool that you are using should be able to accommodate the requirements traceability bidirectionally. Additionally, the tool should be able to track additional elements in terms of source code check-in, automation, and all those things. The tool should be able to provide some element of dashboard reporting instead of letting you figure all these things out. And finally, there should be some element of custom reporting functionality that is available as well. So, these are some of the needs by which you can create an ad hoc documentation that will meet the documentation needs of it, unless otherwise you have to create some specific documentation like entity relationship model or a UML diagram for class interactions and all those things. If those things are required, these things are not necessarily going to give you that, but at least you have some elements of documentation that can be done. Okay, so that's practice number 2. And then the practice number 3 is going to be constantly expanding towards readiness. Right, so you have the deep property about how the user story should be developed in the backlog, but before this, people can commit to doing a user story, it needs to have a little bit more, right? And so you want to iterate that towards the next step, and the next step is going to be getting ready and getting done. So when is the user story ready for me to work on, and what are the things that I need to have on that particular story so that I can consider it complete as part at the end of the iteration? Right. So what are some of the prerequisites for a user story? Again, similar to how we have deep property, we have what is called an invest property for definition of a user story. And when you look at that, it needs to be independent. So like I mentioned, you cannot have multiple things. So in an iteration, if you are writing user stories, the user story should be written in such a way that no other team member is dependent upon completion of one user story before they can pick up another user story assigned to them. So that is not a good way of doing this. Everything should be as much as possible independent. And if there are some dependency built, then they need to be at different iterations. That way, you are able to have everybody work on it. Unless otherwise there is a good rationale for why you want to have 2 dependent user stories to be built as part of the same iteration. That potentially possible too. There are always exceptions, right? And then negotiable. At some point, the user story has to be negotiated with the product owner to make sure that, we are able to split this up. So how you want to actually complete the work in multiple approaches. So you may want to actually start thinking that particular level of precision during the planning stages. Right? It needs to be valuable. At the end of the day, it needs to provide specific value for the customer, and the customer could be internal customer or external customer. Okay, so it could be a custom value add story or business value add stories. And it needs to be estimable. The users should be able to use those story points to be able to come back and say, I am able to see this is a 3-point story or a 5-point story or whatever it is. They should be able to estimate it. It should be at that level. There should not be any ambiguity at this particular point for them to continue doing it. And it needs to be small. It cannot be so big that it could actually move from one iteration to another iteration to another iteration, because the value of the user story is going to be recognized at the end of the iteration. You are not moving it from one iteration to another iteration at all, right? So it needs to be small. So it needs to be able to split up the user stories in such a way that you are able to, complete the user story in that particular iteration. At the end of the day, it needs to be testable. So you have to make sure that you have, proper acceptance criteria already made available, and you should also make sure that there are automation tests that are returned, so that you are constantly be able to check the same functionality, because as you are moving from one iteration to another iteration, you are not going to be retesting the same functionality. So you need to make sure that there are some test library suites that are getting built so that you are able to actually continuously test those functionality. And there are different tools that are available for that, but my focus is not exactly on that. Okay. And then the user story format, one format that everybody knows is this, as a role, I want this so that I can accomplish this, right? So I'm giving you an example of one user story that I have worked as part of my professional projects in an airline context. So as a frequent flyer member, I want to set up preferences for my flight notification so that I can access the notifications at my preferred communication channel. So a flight delay notification, I would like to make sure that it gets emailed. A gate change notification comes to me on a text. So I want to be able to have these kind of preferences. So I'm able to look at all the different channels of operation, like the email, the text, the voice, and all those things, and come down with all the different potential notifications and create a grid. And that grid has to be one simple UI, and that is one acceptance criteria. The next is going to be quick means to set up the grid available channel. So I'm able to bring up that one particular grid and put all the checks and hit the submit button. I want an email that confirms what my preferences are, and if I had selected a mobile delivery and I want a mobile message delivered to my phone to confirm that this is the case. These are my acceptance criteria. So I have obviously simplified this for the presentation, but you are able to see how the format looks. This is how you want to evolve. But like I mentioned, you also want to treat the system as a potential user. And so you want to look at it from a system standpoint also. And there is a different format that exists for that. So that's a user story B. So, given certain condition is met, when something happens, then I want something to, something to be done. Right, that's this format. So this is used for mostly the system-specific scenarios. So this is also from another project that I have done in a retail pharmacy setting, where you have to get notifications out that basically says your prescription is ready for pickup or something like that. So given 20% of the unprocessed call volume at a specific point in time, when remaining time to process the volume is less than 2 hours. So if the amount of time left is only 2 hours or less, then I want a production alert to be raised so that somebody can actually go and increase the number of ports or throttles to make sure that that extra volume can be consumed, right? So what are some of the prerequisites for the system-specific notification or user story to be complete? Expected hourly call volume is expected first computed before the calls are getting initiated. So before the calls go out, I need to make sure that such a prerequisite is already met. And then the calls are prioritized by the time zone. And subsequently, there are separate process to poll how many actual ports are existing and how many different calls are being queued in every port. That should be available in a dashboard. And finally, call queuing should be adjustable. So if I add additional ports or throttle, then the remaining calls should be automatically be able to flex and adjust rather than me constantly coming and figuring out how to push this. So this is an expectation. So this is an architectural level thinking that should have already existed before this kind of a story can be executed. So you have to start thinking sustainability of the product constantly in the market, and you have to start thinking of some specific system-specific scenarios as well in this particular format. That's another approach, okay? Now, furthermore, good stories have to have certain important things. I've already alluded to all these things, but build acceptance criteria. So agree with the team on what they should build before they begin the work. So it's not like what I write as a product owner, it's what we as a team agree on. So we need to agree on this before, a single line, before the hands are on the keyboard, coding. Ensure everyone has a common understanding of both the business need, why are we doing this, as well as what will happen if we do not deliver. So we need to be able to qualify and quantify as possible the business impact, like, $5,000 penalty will be assessed if you don't do this. We need to be able to come down to that level if possible. And then confirm when a story can be considered complete. If I list 4 different criteria, are all the 4 absolutely required, which means they have to be complete. So there's no negotiation. Like, if I finish 3 of them and the 4th one is not done, well, then it's not done, right? You don't have this. I'll finish part of it and gain partial credits. You cannot do all those things. And then verify that the story can be tested automatically for future iterations. Like I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you have some automated suite of test libraries getting constantly built, so that as you are moving forward with subsequent iterations with new functionality, you are not spending more and more time on fixing the old issues again and again and again, or repeating the testing again and again and again. And each story should be written in such a way that as you collect the feedback, what will the user most likely want to do next? Now that the user is here in this particular section of the website, in this particular section of the mobile app, what should I do next? How can we prepare the user for any information needed next? So for instance, if you have seen some of the websites where before you hit the submit button or the check button, it will basically say you will be required to have a license ready, or you have to have these personal information about you ready, because that will be required in the next screen. So, when you click on this, you are not going to the next screen and waiting, but you are already preparing that person. So where can the user be confused looking for help, in the user interface or the product? What can confuse that person? When you put so many other things on the thing, what can confuse that individual? And finally, what errors may lead the user to fail completing the goal? I am so confused, I don't know where I'm going, so I am dropping out. So you need to think through that user journey in your thought process before you actually start developing the user story. But when you have already developed a user story, think at that point extending that functionality for fault, error, better features, all those things, and start looking into those things. And realize that sometimes some elements are not going to be stories at all. So some elements are not going to be good stories at all. Work that needs to be continuously done in operation. For instance, I had to get so many emails out from the calls that are coming from the previous day. That's not a user story that you can write. That's when Kanban comes into the play in terms of lean management and things like that. Guidelines around the user interfaces, like the branding guidelines, color guidelines. If you have all of those things, asking them to develop a branding guideline may be a user story. But not necessarily ensuring that how you actually apply them and modify them and revise them are supposed to be done that way. Again, in some of the companies with regulatory natures, you may be required to create some screen captures. Now, if that is really required, how you go about creating a screen capture itself is not supposed to be part of the user story. These are all operational tasks, right? A checklist of some sort. Work developed by a vendor. If a vendor is actually working under a different contract, delivering some work, how you may interface that particular products into your workflow may be a user story, but how that particular person is not something that you want to create a user story to monitor that individual. And some cost of quality initiatives, whether it comes under the cost of conformance or cost of non-conformance, like training initiatives, warranty, lessons learned. All those things are not necessarily supposed to be a story that you want to track. Certain things are supposed to happen, and don't try to put stories to actually fill the backlog with those kind of things. Okay. So some golden rules from best practices that I am going to apply for PMI project management framework as well as in Agile framework. They extend equally well. So one of the thing is the 100% rule. So in the project management framework, we talk about the 100% rule, and that applies in the Agile framework as well. So the WBS, or the work breakdown structure, should have 100% of the project scope alone, and not necessarily gold plate or include scope creep. The same thing with the Agile framework. You want to make sure that your release plan is only focusing on the 100% of the MVP, or the minimum viable product, that focuses on the customer and the business needs, right? That's the 100% rule. You don't want to keep adding different things at some point. And then the 2-week rule. So in project management world, we say every 2 weeks there should be a measurable and agreed upon deliverable. You don't go back and say a project starts and 3 months later show me a deliverable. That doesn't work that way. So even in project management framework, we have a 2-week rule. And the Agile framework basically says at the end of every 2 weeks, there should be a measurable and agreed upon, minimally marketable features that are getting delivered as part of the iterations, right? And finally, a 40-hour rule. So every week, no task should be a 40-hour task. The sooner you are able to find out that it's not going in the right order, the sooner you will be able to, put the appropriate structure to help that delivery. So you don't have the schedule slips later. Similar thing with the Agile framework. So you don't want to have a 40-point story to be done by one individual because it's too big. So the recommendation is that, don't have any more than 13 points. That should be as big as a story that a user should be able to commit, or a team member should be able to commit. regardless of their source expertise. So these are all some of the golden rules that I have found out to be helpful, whether it is in the project management context or in the agile context. The terms and terminologies differ, but at the end of the day, certain things still apply. And finally, the practice number 4. At the end of the day, good user story development is all about how the team performs, or how the team collaborates and engages, right? So there has to be buy-in from the team in terms of what the commitments are. And finally, let the team figure out the how. The product owner should not get too much into the microscopic aspects of the how. So let's focus on some of those elements over here. So when you're looking at the estimation processes within the user story for an iteration, or sometimes even release planning, look at the time horizon. So when you look at the time horizon, things take different meaning. So if you want to build a dream castle or something like that, at the very high end, it's going to be a huge epic, right? So an idea comes up, and that idea is actually getting broken down into multiple epics. So the dream of me having a huge mansion is now getting reduced to maybe a good sized castle. And then, as we talk further and further, it becomes reduced to a big house, or we are able to actually bring it down to, multiple levels of different teams that I have to build. And from the teams, I'm actually saying like, okay, what do you want inside that particular big house, which is getting developed into, multiple features. And those features are the one that actually, are good enough for us to continue to estimate. And then you are moving forward with breaking down those things into multiple user stories, and then the user stories are getting broken down into tasks. So the duplex home becomes a 2-bedroom apartment, or a 2-bedroom apartment becomes, how do I get a loan approval for me to get this 2-bedroom apartment? So you can build this theme as you are moving forward. So what are the things that you should really estimate? So at the idea and epic level, they are too big. They're way too big for us to do any kind of estimation, because even if you do any kind of estimation, that is useless. It's not something that is implementable. The next one is going to be at theme and features level. You can have high level estimates, like a t-shirt size, which is going to be extra small, medium, large, and all those things. But that's still not going to be something that you are going to go to implement with. And only at the user story level, you are building the the story points, and then you are moving down to the tasks with the actual team. Now, without the team in place, you are never going to be able to flush this out completely. So the team does not come towards the way end of the task, but you are actually involving them right from day one. Like, I have an idea. The idea may be from the product owner, the idea may be from the team member themselves. So as you are fleshing them out, you are moving those team members along this curve, involving and engaging and collaborating with them constantly. Without that, Agile will not necessarily deliver the value promised. Right. So let the team work on the task. So when you're looking at the why, you want to make sure, as I mentioned, the business value for the customer. While you are articulating that, it is the product owner and the project manager's responsibility to also understand what's the business impact of not building this functionality. Without the business impact, you cannot justify the value alone. And then what's the business impact of deferring this to subsequent iterations or subsequent releases? You have to understand that. And then when it comes to the who, we talked about the persona. What is the different types of user persona we want, and then develop this functionality for them. When you're looking at the what, you are focusing on the benefit of the functionality. By doing this, I'm able to accomplish this, not do something for the sake of doing, right? And finally, how. And the tasks come over here, and these are the specific activities that the team needs to get done in some particular order, so that they are able to deliver the outcome. Let the team focus on that, because they are the subject matter experts on this. We need to support them, motivate them to make sure that it's getting done. But then if the user stories are developed and written in such a way, then the tasks will automatically fall in place with a self-organized team. Okay, so what are some of the good story development means? Okay, so they are always written in the active voice. You don't write them in a passive voice. You write them in an active voice, so that I know exactly what needs to be done. The second thing is, people have a tendency to tag them with a number, like 15, story number 15, And then as you are breaking it down with the team, you call it 15.1, 15.1.1, all those things. Those are not good practices. You want to tag them with a title. That's the theme that we talked about, or the features that we talked about. Security, performance, stability, sustainability, user interface, whatever that is. Online shopping cart. So those things are better to actually tag the user stories that way rather than naming them with 13.1, because if you come and say 13.1, I cannot necessarily relate to them. But if you come and tell me, I'm relating to a security story, I may be able to relate to them. Besides, as things are getting combined at a later point, then 13.1 and 14.1 may have similar relationship, but you are not able to combine them because one is in a 13 section, one is a 14 section. So it's not good to have this kind of naming conventions with the number. And then the accuracy of estimates. Don't try to have an estimate in the backlog. Only try to estimate what needs to be done in the sprint or the iteration, because you can use other approaches like the t-shirt sizing I mentioned or relative sizing I mentioned. You can have them, but realize that the accuracy of the estimates only gets better as the story becomes more granular. Scan the market for missed persona. So as you are going to the customers with, this is how my product is working and all those things, use other mechanisms by which you can interface and observe how your product is interfacing with the customer. And based upon that, scan, any persona that you may have missed, maybe a user with a disability, those kind of things, or an aggravated user. So I understand those things and try to bring it down to the user story development. And finally, incorporate proactively the risks component. Don't expect that because you are working on a 2-week iteration, there is no risk at all. That's not acceptable at all. So try to incorporate. That's why even product backlog is supposed to be called risk adjusted product backlog. Right. So those are some of the things. So finally, as I'm trying to wrap up, when you're looking at this last section, you want to make sure that you are looking at what I call a TOE principle: technical feasibility, operational feasibility, and environmental feasibility. As you are getting a story to be done, you are looking at, can we really do this? Do we have the appropriate technical skill set, technical infrastructure to actually do this? And even if we do this, is this something that we can manage in the operation? If that's not something that we can manage, then probably not the right time to do it, or probably needs some additional thought process before we actually push this to the queue. And then finally, can we afford it? Is the environment going to sustain it? As soon as you provide a new functionality, that may be coming up with some additional thoughts, but you already have a lot of other things. So you have to look at from an environmental process, whether this is something that you can sustain it for, continuously. So look at this as a guideline to see how you basically can start developing the appropriate user stories. Okay. So good user story development practices, as a result, I'm summarizing over here. Those are the 4 practices. So understanding the persona, big picture, iteration, and then team collaboration. So when you're looking at understanding the persona, there has to be a specific goal, and there has to be a good number of collection to represent the entire system, and reduces technical architecture risk that may happen in the immediate future, and also demonstrates partial release of the functionality. And when you are looking at the big picture, you want to start thinking in terms of some low fidelity model, and then start interfacing with the user interface and user journey, and also build appropriate constraints that will require some particular user story to be flushed out a little bit more or done at a later point in time. And the practice number 3 is focusing on getting ready. So you're basically making sure that there are proper, valid, acceptable acceptance criteria, and they continuously extend the functionality and realize that some are not good enough to be listed as stories at all. Right. And finally, team collaboration, promote them in the active voice, use text tagging rather than number tagging, and understand that the accuracy evolves, and scan for additional missed persona that may have been missed, and proactively incorporate risk. So those are the good user story development practices that I have found to be very useful at this point. So if there are any questions, please make sure that you are able to ask me right now. I'll open up the panel right now. And if there are any questions relating to the course administration, please reach out to marketing@inflectra.com. Again, please make sure that you are able to register for the third webinar in the series. And if I don't talk to you, happy holidays. Let me now open up the panel for questions. So there is one question here. Can these user stories be invest? I mean, if I write a high level story, it will not be small. If the story is written using the invest property, yes stands for the small. So I'm not sure 100% I understood that question. So if you are using the invest property to write the story, then it will be small. What does low fidelity mean? So instead of trying to come up with extremely high fidelity architecture, where the user will start, where the user journey will go, what are all the potential ways things will go, and things like that, you are coming up with some high level thoughts. Sometimes people call this a wireframe or a user journey or something like that, where you are basically trying to say what are the big things that we want to build as part of the minimum viable product. So that's the low fidelity, but most often it's going to be either using some kind of a hierarchical diagram, or it could be using some level of cause and effect diagram, or it could also use some level of flow charting if possible. So those are the low fidelity approaches as to how you are developing a small prototype visually, and not a working prototype, a visual prototype that can help you guide in terms of what the user story should be. All right, if there are no further questions, thank you very much. Again, happy holidays to all of you. I look forward to seeing you in webinar 3.